A century ago, America had the best passenger rail network on Earth, moving millions of people in comfort and style. Today, taking a train across the country is slower than it was in 1950. How did the world leader fall this far? In the opening decades of the 20th century, the American railroad network stood as the largest infrastructure system the world had ever seen. By 1916, the nation's steel rails spanned more than 254,000 miles, expanding to 266,000 miles the following year. This massive web linked major cities while reaching deep into the American territory through more than 85,000 individual railroad stops, connecting remote prairie towns and industrial hubs alike. In 1920, annual ridership on this network peaked at approximately 1.2 billion passengers. That year, the average American traveled an estimated 383 miles by train, relying on the railway as the primary means of long-distance movement. The industry itself was an economic giant. A 1923 study by the National Bureau of Economic Research recorded that the steam railway sector held $20 billion in capital, matching the nearly $19 billion in property valuations calculated by the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1920. The railroads employed 2 million workers and paid $3 billion in annual wages, making these carriers some of the most powerful corporations in the country. At the height of this era, passenger rail was synonymous with national sophistication and luxury. Flagship services functioned as mobile hotels, offering Pullman sleeping cars, fine dining, and unmatched prestige. The New York Central's 20th Century Limited covered the 958 miles between New York and Chicago in 16 hours, maintaining a steady average of 60 miles per hour. Further west, the Santa Fe Super Chief ran between Chicago and Los Angeles, averaging 60 miles per hour with top speeds approaching 100 miles per hour along level stretches of track. Passengers boarded these named trains through architectural monuments built to celebrate the prestige of rail travel. New York's original Pennsylvania Station, completed in 1910, and Grand Central Terminal, opened in 1913, featured vast classical columns and marble halls that served as civic gateways. This network was the coordinator of everyday life, carrying federal mail, securing local commerce, and providing a reliable link between families separated by thousands of miles. It was a unified system operating at a scale and speed that defined the rapid growth of the nation. The shrinking of this massive network is often treated as a natural commercial evolution, a simple story of Americans willingly trading steel tracks for asphalt highways and airport runways. But the data shows a deeper contradiction. The physical retreat of passenger rail did not match a decline in the public's need for transportation. In the decades following the network's peak, the United States underwent a massive population expansion, growing from 106 million people in 1920 to over 179 million by 1960. Millions of these citizens still required reliable, affordable, long-distance transit. Urban centers swelled and rural communities remained dependent on passenger trains to access regional markets, medical facilities, and family connections. Yet even as the potential customer base expanded, the railway network contracted, leaving towns stranded and forcing travelers into more expensive alternatives. This was not a passive fade-out driven by a sudden, universal distaste for trains. It was a systemic dismantling. The central mystery of this collapse lies in how an essential public service, actively utilized by millions, became structurally unsustainable under private ownership. The demand for mobility was growing, yet the framework supporting the tracks was systematically starved of viability. Understanding this decline requires looking beyond changing consumer preferences and examining the specific conditions, rules, and policy decisions that actively penalized passenger rail. The collapse was not an accident of geography or passenger choice. It was a consequence of structured incentives. In 1908, a brand new Ford Model T cost $825. By 1925, Mass production streamlined the assembly process so efficiently that the price plummeted to just $300. For the first time, ownership of a personal vehicle was a realistic goal for ordinary working-class families. This shift was far more than a simple upgrade in machinery. It was a profound cultural transformation that quietly began to redraft the rules of daily travel. For generations, long-distance movement required conforming to a rigid public system. Travelers had to adapt to fixed timetables, purchase tickets in advance, and share their physical space with strangers in crowded passenger coaches. The automobile offered a completely different promise: absolute personal autonomy. A driver could set out at any hour of the day or night, choose their own route, stop whenever they pleased, and carry their belongings without relying on baggage handlers. It was a highly personalized way of moving through the world that made the railroad's rigid schedules feel increasingly restrictive and obsolete. As millions of families acquired their first cars, the collective expectation of travel transformed. The train was no longer the default center of American life. It was becoming an option, rather than a necessity. This initial drift away from the passenger coach reflected a slow, organic transition in daily habits. Before the federal government ever spent a single dollar on the interstate highway system, the social fabric of the country was already restructuring itself around the steering wheel and the open road. On June 29, 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act into law, initiating the largest public works project in American history. The legislation authorized $25 billion in federal appropriations, with $13.4 billion earmarked specifically for the construction of a 41,000-mile network of interstate highways. To secure political support during the Cold War, the administration framed this massive build-out as a matter of national defense, arguing that a modern road system was essential for moving military convoys and evacuating major cities in the event of a nuclear emergency. To guarantee the long-term survival of this project, Congress established the Highway Trust Fund. This financial mechanism collected dedicated taxes on motor fuel, tires, and heavy trucks, creating a permanent self-sustaining funding loop. As Americans bought more cars and gasoline, the trust fund automatically grew, channeling billions of dollars back into road construction without requiring annual approval from Congress. This structural design turned road building into a durable public subsidy, decoupling highway expansion from actual consumer demand. The scale of this public commitment dwarfed the private capital of the railroad industry, which had spent nearly a century building its own network. For comparison, the Interstate Commerce Commission's valuation of all railroad property in 1920 stood at $18.9 billion. This private asset base, accumulated over generations, was suddenly eclipsed by a single federal highway authorization. This massive injection of public money created a stark economic divide between roads and rails. While the federal government covered 90% of interstate highway construction costs, the nation's railroads remained entirely self-funded. Private rail companies had to pay for their own track construction, purchase their own safety equipment, and maintain their own rights of way. Railroads also paid heavy property taxes on their tracks and stations. In 1949, for example, the New York Central Railroad paid over $50 million in taxes, amounting to 7% of its gross operating revenue. Every mile of railroad track was a taxed private asset, while the competing highway running parallel to it was a tax-exempt public benefit. The heavy capital cost of maintaining thousands of miles of private steel infrastructure directly competed with passenger operations for survival. As federal dollars poured into concrete highways, private rail carriers were forced to absorb the full financial weight of their fixed asset base. The American transportation system transitioned to automobiles, because of a deliberate government program that socialized the costs of driving while leaving passenger rail to survive under the weight of its own private taxes. In 1946, Congress passed the Federal Airport Act, establishing a massive public funding program to develop civil aviation infrastructure. Under this legislation, the federal government committed to covering half the cost of building public airports across the nation. This matching fund structure allowed local governments to construct modern municipal terminals and runways using federal dollars, shielding commercial airlines from the immense capital costs of building their own facilities. In 1958, the Federal Aviation Act expanded this public support by establishing a nationwide, taxpayer-funded air traffic control system. This transferred the daily responsibility of tracking flights, managing airspace, and maintaining safety networks directly onto a federal agency. These policy choices created a profound structural imbalance in American transportation. Commercial airlines did not have to purchase land, lay down asphalt, or pay local property taxes on the routes they traveled. Instead, their operations relied entirely on publicly constructed hubs and a federally managed navigation network. Much like the expanding highway network, the aviation sector received a permanent public safety net that kept its operating costs artificially low. Private passenger railroads, on the other hand, had to purchase every foot of their own right-of-way, pay for their own signal systems, and bear the full tax burden of their physical stations. In this emerging national transportation system, the rules of competition were clear. Two rival modes operated on publicly funded, tax-exempt infrastructure, while the passenger train was forced to pay its own way. In 1949, the New York Central Railroad paid $50.9 million in taxes. This single tax bill consumed 7% of the company's gross operating revenues. Adjusted for inflation, that represents over $550 million paid in a single year, largely levied on the physical tracks, passenger stations, and yards the railroad owned and maintained. At the exact same time, the company had to reinvest $1.13 billion into its physical network to repair aging rails, purchase locomotives, and update signaling systems. The railroad's net operating income for that year was only $167 million, leaving a dangerously thin margin to support passenger services that were rapidly losing riders. Adding to this pressure was a rigid operating cost structure. By the late 1960s, labor costs consumed over 30% of total operating expenses for Class I carriers. Union contracts, negotiated under federal oversight, preserved strict rules governing crew sizes and mileage limits, preventing railroads from adopting labor-saving technologies that could lower costs. As payroll expenses rose, railroads found themselves unable to adjust their operations to meet changing economic realities. The ultimate trap was regulatory. Under the Interstate Commerce Act, the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, held absolute authority over both the prices railroads could charge and the routes they were permitted to run. Railroad executives could not raise freight or passenger rates without months of hearings and regulatory filings, a process that cost up to 2% of total revenues in administrative overhead alone. Even as passenger trains emptied out, the ICC routinely rejected petitions to discontinue unprofitable runs. Under the Commission's strict cost formulas, private railroads were legally obligated to keep empty trains running, absorbing losses that collectively reached $200 million per year by 1970. This system forced freight revenues to subsidize failing passenger operations, draining the capital needed to maintain track and compete in a modern shipping market. Private railroads were locked inside a cost structure they could neither control nor escape. When revenues shrank under the weight of federal regulations, railroads responded by cutting costs. To offset their mounting losses, companies began trimming their operations. They eliminated stops in smaller towns, reduced the frequency of daily runs, and deferred maintenance on passenger cars and stations. These cost-cutting measures had immediate consequences. Fewer trains meant less convenient schedules. Passengers who once relied on multiple daily departures now found only one or two options. As stations fell into disrepair and travel times lengthened due to neglected tracks, the quality of the journey deteriorated. This loss of quality drove the next turn of the cycle. Faced with less reliable and less frequent service, more passengers abandoned the tracks for automobiles and airplanes. This second wave of departures caused revenues to drop even further, forcing railroads to make another round of service cuts. The numbers show how rapidly this feedback loop dismantled the network. Between 1950 and 1960, national inter-city passenger miles per capita plunged from 224 miles to just 53 miles. On the heavily traveled corridor between Chicago and St. Louis, the railroads cut daily train frequencies by 50% during this single decade. Each cut drove away more riders, and each loss of riders triggered further cuts. The decline had become a self-reinforcing mechanism, a structural death spiral that left passengers with fewer options and railroads with fewer customers. In February 1968, the two largest railroads in the Northeast, the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central, merged. The new company, named Penn Central, was a desperate attempt to find safety in scale. By combining operations, executives hoped to cut duplicate routes, reduce administrative overhead, and save their collapsing passenger businesses. Instead, the merger united two incompatible corporate cultures and separate, non-communicating computer systems. Penn Central was also forced by federal regulators to absorb another failing line, the New York, New Haven, and Hartford. The new conglomerate inherited over 20,000 miles of track, carrying about 1/8 of the nation's freight along with a $9.8 billion debt load. The operational friction was immediate. Freight cars got lost in congested yards, passenger trains ran hours behind schedule, and daily losses reached $1 million. The company was rapidly running out of cash to pay its workers or maintain its tracks. On June 21, 1970, just 2 years after the merger, Penn Central declared bankruptcy. At the time, it was the largest corporate collapse in United States history. The failure shocked the American financial system and threatened to halt freight shipments across the industrialized Northeast. It proved that the private railroad industry could no longer self-finance its infrastructure while carrying the heavy loss of passenger operations. The bankruptcy turned a long-running, quiet decline into an immediate national crisis. The federal government could no longer look away or rely on private capital to keep the passenger rail system running. On October 30, 1970, President Richard Nixon signed the Rail Passenger Service Act. This legislation did not establish a subsidized modern public transit system. Instead, it was a political compromise designed to rescue the private railroad industry from its passenger losses. The deal was simple. Private railroads could turn over their money, losing passenger operations to a new government-funded corporation named Amtrak, which officially began service on May 1, 1971. In exchange for a small entry fee and 95% of their passenger cars and locomotives, these private carriers walked away from their legal obligation to run passenger trains. But the private railroads gave up very little. They kept ownership of the actual tracks, yards, and rights of way, retaining the highly profitable freight shipping business that had built their empires. Amtrak was handed the aging passenger fleet, but owned almost none of the physical steel rails it needed to operate. Congress initially funded Amtrak with a modest $40 million grant and $100 million in federal loan guarantees, expecting the new company to become profitable within 3 years. This arrangement was less of a public transport network rebuild and more of an offloading mechanism. While the rescue preserved some existing trains, it did not restore a strong passenger network. The federal government had not resolved the structural crisis facing American passenger rail, It had merely assumed the financial losses while leaving the physical infrastructure in private hands. The problem was transferred, but the system remained fundamentally broken. Amtrak began operations with a fundamental structural deficit, inheriting a national passenger network without owning the actual ground beneath it. The new corporation assumed responsibility for passenger service across thousands of miles of route, but 97% of those tracks remained the private property of host freight railroads. From its first day, Amtrak had to lease access to these lines, running 72% of its total train miles on tracks controlled by competing commercial carriers. This physical separation of track ownership from train operations created a permanent conflict of interest at the dispatch board. Although federal law mandated that passenger trains receive preference over freight traffic, enforcement mechanisms were virtually non-existent. Private freight companies retained complete control over the switches and signals, operating as gatekeepers. When a dispatching choice arose between a mile-long freight train carrying commercial cargo and a passenger train carrying citizens, the freight dispatchers routinely prioritized their own corporate operations. Passenger trains were repeatedly shunted onto sidings, forced to wait while slow-moving freight cars cleared the main line. The economic consequences of this design were immediate and lasting. Congress initially expected Amtrak to achieve self-sufficiency within 3 years, yet it provided only $40 million in startup grants, a fraction of the capital required to maintain basic operations, let alone modernize aging equipment. Deprived of a dedicated trust fund like the highway system, Amtrak had to rely on annual, politically contested federal appropriations that barely covered basic maintenance. The operational toll of this underfunding and lack of track control is measured in minutes of delay. By 2024, freight train interference remained the leading cause of delays, accumulating 850,000 minutes of passenger holdups in a single year. This structural bottleneck dragged Amtrak's overall on-time performance down to just 42%, far below the Federal Railroad Administration's 80% standard. Delays were built directly into this operating structure, ensuring that the rescue of passenger rail inherited permanent disadvantages. Without owning its own tracks or possessing the authority to enforce its statutory dispatch priority, Amtrak remained a tenant on a network designed for cargo. On October 1, 1964, the Japanese National Railways inaugurated the Tokaido Shinkansen, a dedicated high-speed rail line connecting Tokyo and Osaka. Operating at an initial speed of 130 miles per hour, these bullet trains bypassed conventional rail bottlenecks by running on entirely separate, grade-separated tracks. Within a few years, daily ridership on this corridor surpassed 600,000 passengers, proving that fast, reliable trains could outcompete domestic aviation and automobiles in a modern economy. This public success was not an isolated experiment. In 1981, France launched the train à grande vitesse, or TGV, connecting Paris and Lyon at commercial speeds reaching 200 miles per hour. A decade later, in 1991, Germany introduced the Intercity Express, or ICE, linking major urban hubs like Hamburg and Munich. Like Japan, these European nations backed their rail networks with billions of dollars in state funding from national transportation budgets dedicated entirely to passenger infrastructure. This comparison reveals that the decline of passenger rail was not an inevitable consequence of 20th century technology or shifting public demand. Japan and Europe faced the same post-war rise of the personal automobile and the commercial jet airliner as the United States. Yet their governments chose to treat passenger rail as an essential public utility worthy of direct capital investment, rather than a private enterprise that had to fund its own tracks. By building dedicated, state-owned corridors separated from freight traffic, these countries ensured their trains remained fast, punctual, and central to national mobility. This contrast shows that the limitations of the American system were not technological barriers, but the consequence of a policy framework that chose to starve the tracks while funding the roads and skies. When the tracks went silent in hundreds of towns across the American interior, they left behind a quiet, enduring isolation. In June 1968, the town of McCook, Nebraska, watched its final passenger train depart when the Rocky Mountain Limited was discontinued. For local farmers, families, and school children, a simple journey turned into a 5-hour bus trip just to reach the nearest remaining rail hub. Across the Great Plains and the rural South, this scenario repeated thousands of times, systematically cutting off communities from regional medical centers, jobs, and family connections. The assumption behind this national retreat was that every American would simply buy a car or book a flight. But that assumption ignored millions of people. Today, 30% of U.S. households do not have convenient access to a commercial airport, a gap felt most acutely in rural regions. For others, the barrier is financial. High-speed highways and airline terminals are useless to the 15% of low-income households who do not own a private vehicle, and to the millions who cannot afford the steep cost of a last-minute plane ticket. For these transit-dependent families, the disappearance of a dependable intercity train network is not an inconvenience. It is a barrier to basic mobility. This forced reliance on asphalt and runways carries a heavy collective cost. Replacing trains with cars and short-haul flights has dramatically increased the country's carbon footprint. According to environmental data, electric intercity rail produces just 0.06 kilograms of carbon dioxide per passenger mile. A typical car trip generates more than 3 times that amount, while a short-haul flight produces 4 times as much. By systematically dismantling a low-emission transit system, policy choices locked generations of travelers into the most polluting options available. The need for the passenger train never actually vanished. The country simply left its most vulnerable citizens without a choice, and the environment with the bill. Today, America's gridlock is not an accident. It is a daily monument to policy choices that favored concrete over community. While other nations race forward, millions of Americans remain stranded, cut off from affordable mobility. The decay of our passenger rail was never inevitable, and rebuilding it remains a choice we make every single day. What do you think? Let's discuss in the comments.